Hello. So today's video is going to be all about MIDI, more specifically MIDI routing. I just got the Midihub, which is a MIDI router and creative router. And also because I've been getting quite a few new devices since the beginning of the year that I haven't actually found a permanent place into the setup, I'm going to need to take everything down and then rewire and everything. But before I do that, I want to start thinking about how I can sort of rearrange everything from a MIDI perspective and where to put the Midihub into that setup. Alright, so my goal is to have a MIDI setup where I can access everything easily without having to constantly change the routing. So let's start with the sequencers. This is a Squarp pyramid. It's the core of my setup. The pyramid has a MIDI in, 2 MIDI outs, and MIDI over a USB. However, because both MIDI inputs are merged, that's a single MIDI in and 3 MIDI outs. But I also want to add the noodle box to the mix and use it over MIDI as well as CV gate. So that's an additional input and output. And I want both sequencers to access any of the synths available. Next are the routers, starting with the Midihub. The Midihub has 4 DIN inputs and 4 DIN outputs, as well as 4 USB MIDI ports. Sadly, it's not a USB host, so I'll still need a USB hub and another device to be the host and handle all of the USB MIDI routing, which is why I'm keeping the iConnect MIDI 4 Plus. The iConnect also has 4 DIN inputs and outputs. It is a USB host and can support up to 8 USB devices attached to a powered USB hub. It also supports up to 3 host computers over USB, MIDI and audio over Ethernet, and a few other things that I don't really use yet. So let's talk about the routing. Because I'm planning to use the Midihub as a creative MIDI processor, I want to intercept every single MIDI signal coming in or out of the sequencers. So that means out A and B of the pyramid, the input and output of the noodle box, the input and the USB output of the pyramid, and send all of that to the iConnect over USB MIDI. So this is what it looks like in the Midihub editor. Pyramid A goes to USB A, Pyramid B goes to USB B, Pyramid C goes to C, and from USB A to DIN A for the pyramid's input. The input of the noodle box is mainly to get the clock, so we'll get it from the Pyramid A, filter anything else, and send that to DIN D. I want to map the output of the noodle box to the same outputs as the pyramid, so you can access all the same synths. And I'll map a CC channel to swap between USB A, B, or C. I can then modify this base setup to add processing nodes to creatively modify any MIDI stream going in or out of the sequencers. Next in the chain is the iConnect router, which I'm going to keep using as a static router, dispatching the controllers to the sequencer input and allocating the 48 available MIDI channels to the sound modules. So let's start with the controllers, because I don't have that many of them. First, there's the Midiplus X6 Mini, which is my main keyboard controller, and I'll connect it over USB. Then there's the Nordrum 3P, connected to DIN 2, the Alesis Nitro, connected to DIN 3. Now that drum kit is Paula's, but I'm sure she'll be happy to be part of the setup. And lastly, I'm getting the Artifon Orba, which I'm planning to plug over USB, although I'll have to figure out how to do Bluetooth over USB. I haven't received the Orba yet, but I probably will by the time I post this video. The synthesizers is where the MIDI allocation gets complicated. With my new additions, I now have 22 MIDI devices, but because some of them are multi-timbral, that's a total of 121 addressable MIDI channels. And since my goal is to have every single device addressable from one of the 3 output ports, I need to fit everything within the 48 channels. It also means I'll be using a few MIDI splitters because I don't want to rely on long through chains. First, there's a DIY MIDI sizers that I've modified to accept either DIN or the new 3.5 MIDI jack standard, 2 MIDI plus 1x7, and I just got this Presto splitter from Microdesignum, which can either be a 1:8 or 2:4 splitter. Alright, so port A is mostly drum machines and samplers, aka things that can also be used as drum machines. So this is what we have. Nordrum 3P gets channel 1 to 3 for individual pads, and global on channel 10. The Blackbox gets 4 channels, from 4 to 7. Then we have the Bastl THYME on 8, MicroGranny on 9, the Tanzbär Lite on channel 10, and the MFB 301 Pro on channel 11. That leaves 5 channels for the Deluge, from 12 to 16. Port B is all the analog mono synths and the digital polys. So we have Ocoast, Ants, Nix, Modor, get a channel each, and the Blofeld uses the last 6 channels from 11 to 16. The last one is port C, which used to be almost completely dedicated to my Yamaha Rompler, which has 2 MIDI input ports and can access 32 channels. So in the new setup, we'll have the MU80 from 1 to 4, then the Prina FM2 on channel 5 to 8, the Alesis Nitro module on channel 9. I also use the MU80 as a general MIDI down machine on channel 10, and finally the Behringer Model D on channel 11. That leaves me channel 12 to 15 currently unassigned, and I'm reserving channel 16 as a loopback channel for the Pyramid. And that completes the allocation. If you have any questions about my MIDI routing, feel free to ask in the comments. And that's it. Merci et à bientôt.